that was just, well, it was granted in 2019, but I've been on leave. So really I have about close to 4.5 years left on the project. The premises of the project, first of all, as everyone here I think knows, many South African speakers are proficient in numerous South African languages. For example, I've been reading recently Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, and just on a couple of pages, he mentions either him or his mother or both of them speaking English, Xhosa, Zulu, German, Afrikaans, Sotho, and Tswana. And I think this list is, except for maybe the German, which was his father's language, is not at all uncommon for a South African speaker to have this many languages in their repertoire. This is a map of distributions of first languages according to the census in South Africa, and it looks very neat and organized. And okay, there are different areas where different languages are very broadly spoken, but then if you add second languages, the map looks a lot different. And this is based on the question, which two languages does this person speak most often in this household? Obviously, if you were to ask more detailed questions, the picture would get even more complex. These languages, and even those languages that are closely related, have differences at all linguistic levels, and some differences are quite obvious and some are rather subtle. And multilingual discourse in South Africa is pervasive and largely naturalistic. But what this describes most communication for most of human history. So most societies, I think, for most of the history of the world, have spoken many languages in communication with their neighbors or even within homes. It's only in modern times that we have this idea that people are monolingual and they can learn other languages. However, most studies, although there are of course important exceptions of second language acquisition, focused on circumstances that are fairly unnatural in the history of the world. So speakers in monolingual contexts, countries who are learning languages in school through direct instruction. So here is one rather flat depiction of the relationships between South Africa's official Bantu languages. I didn't make this myself, it's from the web. I know there are other ways of looking at this language family, but we can see here that 4 of South Africa's official Bantu languages are Nguni, 4 are Sotho, Tswana, Venda, and then there's also Tsonga. Even highly similar languages, so even the Nguni languages have differences, of course. Some are obvious, like phonology and vocabulary differences, and some are more subtle. So even some subtle semantic or syntactic or even pragmatic distinctions. And I should say here that at least for the beginning of the project, I'm adopting a rather reified view of languages. So everyone here knows that this is artificial. Language boundaries aren't rigid. Variation within a named language might be greater than variation across 2 named languages, but at least I think we can say that these named South African Bantu languages have been codified and standardized to some extent, at least, and they can constitute important aspect of speaker identities. And there are forms of the languages that can be considered standard. And I'm focusing at first, at least in the first phases of this project, on these standard varieties and their maximal differences. And then as the project proceeds, then nuances, of course, will be added. The aim of the study is to study from qualitative and quantitative perspectives how speakers deal with specific differences between languages and naturalistic multilingual contexts. And the investigative domain is modal expressions. And here I mean largely verbal expressions of possibility and necessity. Why modal verbs? Well, they're very common in languages. You hear them all the time in normal communication. They're also pragmatically important for polite communication. So if you get a modal expression wrong in a particular situation, you can come across as rude, uncouth, or be ineffective. They can be difficult to master in second languages because the distinctions, as I'll show in a second, they don't always fall across the same lines from language to language. And also in South African Bantu languages, they exhibit differences. Even a quick look shows some pretty important differences, and they're understudied in Bantu languages. So we know not enough about tense and aspect, I would say, but we know a lot more about tense and aspect in Bantu than we know about mood. This is changing, mood and modality, this is changing, but a lot more work is needed. So here's an example of one difference. And if you happen to see my talk at the Bantu conference this summer, well, summer in Europe, some of these examples will be familiar to you, but we have English must not versus German muss nicht. And although this is, there are some nuances here too. Generally speaking, must not means that you are not allowed to do something, whereas German muss nicht has the opposite scope. It means you don't have to do something. And you can imagine being in a situation where if you don't master this difference, you might have some communicative issues. The story that I heard, which I told also at the Bantu conference, was, for example, a German businessman, after having worked on a contract for a long time, or something along those lines, and then finally they had everything hammered out and it was ready to go. And then he said, "You mustn't sign it today." And the English-speaking business partner thought, "Wait a second, I'm not allowed to sign it after all of this work." So you can see just this small difference in things that look very similar can cause some fairly significant understanding issues. And then we have Finnish modal verbs of possibility, and this is just a selection of many verbs, and the ones on the top line are fairly flexible. And then as they continue in this list, they have more and more specific grammatic meanings. So for example, this one, vitsia, you use it, you can do something because you feel like it, you have enough energy and willpower. And it's more often used in the negative, I don't really feel like it, or I'm not quite up to it right now. Not exclusively, but that's my understanding. And my favorite one is tarrieta, which is used to say that you're able to withstand the cold in order to do something. It's a very Nordic kind of modal verb. Another example of a difference, which I only know from reading about, I haven't experienced this, but apparently in British or Australian English, to say "I might go now" has a very strong meaning, like I'm definitely going to go now, versus to me as an American native speaker, if someone said "I might go now," it sounds almost strange, like, well, you're not sure if you're going to go or not. Make up your mind. And then finally, we come to some South African language differences. So in the Nguni languages, isiNdebele and isiZulu, this modal auxiliary azi, which literally means know how to do something, can also be learned for something that you use for something that you didn't necessarily learn, like running fast. Running fast in general it's something you get through practice or natural ability, but it's not something that you sit down and come to know how to do it. But this verb can be used in both isiNdebele and isiZulu, whereas in Ndebele, which is also called Northern Transvaal Ndebele, I'll talk a little bit more about the language later, and Sepedi or Northern Sotho, the same verb, as far as I can tell, is not able to be used in that context. And for Sepedi, I've only confirmed this via web searches. So if anyone has different information, I'd be happy to know it. But in all of the languages, this word, which I think has originally Sotho origins, khona, can be used in this context. So there's a difference in whether no can be used, but be able to be used is used in all of them. Although in isiZulu, from my understanding, kona is much less frequent than azi in such contexts. And here are just some examples that you can see that azi is used with can run, and in Zulu type, which is sort of learned, swimming also sort of learned, and then running less learned. Whereas in Ndebele, it's only okay to talk about if you're talking about a toddler who is learning to walk or run for the first time, but you wouldn't use it about a grown person. And similarly, when I did a web search for the Sepedi equivalent, as far as I know, it didn't get any hits, or I think the last time I searched it actually did get one hit, but it was kind of strange. Okay, you already heard about me a little bit, but I was born in the US. I live in Helsinki. Most of my research has been done in Namibia and Zambia, and I've spent about 5 months doing research, mostly at Ndebele and Ndebele in South Africa. And I've been there some more as a traveler, but really I'm not much of an expert in South Africa, and so I'm very happy to have feedback on all aspects of this project, but especially sociolinguistic factors that I might be overlooking. And the project is, as I said, it's meant to take place over 5 years, and there are about 4.5 years left. The first research question that I posed is, along what parameters can closely related languages or varieties maintain semantic and pragmatic differences in their modal systems when they're spoken in intensive context situations, such as what we find in South Africa? Second, how are cross-linguistic differences between modal systems maintained in heavy context situations, and how do differences index speaker and group identity? So you might think if languages are constantly being spoken in multilingual situations, that they would just converge onto a single standard pattern, but I don't think this is what we find in South Africa, indeed. The third question is the quantitative question. How do speakers perceive differences between languages and varieties in their multilingual repertoires? To what degree do they adhere to these differences that they have in their mental depictions of the languages when they're speaking the varieties in questions? And what extent do their perceptions correlate to affral distinctions observed across varieties? So if you are talking about more monolingual speakers, do bilingual speakers then also use modal expressions like monolingual speakers would in each language? And if pragmatic and semantic mismatches occur, then how do interlocutors accommodate them? How does conversation function? Because obviously it does. So the first phase of the project, the aim is to map the modal systems of, as far as possible, all of the major Bantu languages of South Africa and identify important differences in their modal systems. So this is me in February 2020. I was planning a trip to South Africa, leaving in early March, and I was going to carry out a survey, and it was going to be really a wonderful thing. And we all know what happened. This is not a picture of me, but I think many parents can probably relate to working from home with children also being home. So obviously my plan changed. And I think the new plan is actually better because it's much more collaborative. I've been doing virtual collaboration with a number of South African scholars, and we have a comparative modal grammar. The proposal has been accepted by Language Science Press, and it's still underway. And these are at least a partial list of the partners who I've been working with so far, and I'm still looking for partners for several languages, and adding other languages is always a great thing. And this is the status. So with Ndebele, the chapter is nearly finished. isiZulu, it's in progress, and the other chapters are mostly collecting and analyzing data. And for some, we're still looking for collaborators. The reason for this is largely this young person in disguise who is our newest baby, who was born last year and has kept me mostly busy and on leave, and not devoting as much time to this project as would be ideal, but it will be ramping up again very soon. So the strategy for this first phase of the project, we're using questionnaires to create comparative modal mappings. And this is the basic mapping that we're working from. And again, this is repeated from my presentation at the Bantu conference. And it's borrowed from paper from Gluckman and Bowler, who also adapted their typology from Nautze. There are other ways of looking at modal typology, but this is just sort of a basic starting point. So there's flavors and forces of modality, and force is whether it's talking about possibility or necessity and strong or weak, and flavor describes whether something is participant internal or participant external epistemic, which has to do with knowledge. So a participant internal ability modal would be something like, I can play the piano. Deontic, participant external deontic modality might be something like, you can eat a piece of cake after you finished your vegetables, you're allowed to. Goal-oriented or teleological might be, you can braid the ropes to make them stronger. So this is something that is possible in order to achieve your goal. And then epistemic, based on what I know now, the prize could be behind the door. That door number 3, for example, in a game show. Moving down to necessity, participant internal necessity might be, I have to drink coffee to wake up in the morning, otherwise I just can't function. Deontic, participant external modality would be, you have to wear a mask in the store, you're required to, it's the rule, it's the law. Here, the only way to get to that island is to take a boat, you have to. Or we've eliminated all the other doors, and therefore, according to what we know, the prize must be behind that door. And then in this middle weak necessity category, you should help people in need. It's the right thing to do. It's expected. Some caveats, of course, are that boundaries can be fuzzy in a modal typology. Categories are not always sufficiently fine-grained. And as the project proceeds, I think we can also refine the modal maps based on what is relevant in South African languages. The survey itself is adapted from a survey by Van der Klock. And I've tried to adapt the questions so that they more or less fit into South African context and use South African names from different language groups. So here's one example of a question. It describes the law in South Africa as the context on motorcycle helmets. And the target here is a necessity deontic modal expression. And then participants are asked to translate the bolded sentence as naturally as possible into the target language. And we can see some of the example responses given for the survey here. Here's another one that targets a necessity epistemic. So your friend Ndebele grows tomatoes, and you know that she sells them every Friday at the market, and she's there all along. She doesn't have to go, but she always goes. And if someone asks you for where she is, you don't know for sure, but you know what her schedule is, and you know it's Friday, so you say she must be at the market. And then, of course, follow-up is needed because you can see here that we have some possibilities, but you have to make sure, well, the other ones weren't just left out by a chance. So you say, well, is it also possible in this context to say this? And then we can draw from the expressions used maps of how they're used in each language. And this is a picture from the database. So each sentence that is returned gets entered according to the question number. And there's places for notes and speaker notes and further questions about it. And then for each question, then we can call up and see what did each speaker in each language use for each expression. And there's a lot more analysis that is being built into the database. And this is just a sample of one of the chapters that's underway, just so that people can see that it's really happening and what it looks like. And now phase 2, and now we're getting into the stuff that really hasn't happened yet. And so any questions and ideas are welcome. The plan is to select 2 or 3 languages for in-depth study and comparison. And these will be really important for the whole rest of the project. How will the languages be selected? Well, they should have a significant number of bilingual speakers who know each of the languages, and there should be significant differences, modal systems, and even very preliminary investigations show that such language pairs definitely exist. But I don't yet know which languages there will be. And the goal in this phase is to understand the modal languages of these systems, modal systems of these languages in detail, both for their own sake and to be able to compare the two. The tools in this phase will be further questionnaires, corpus work wherever possible, especially if further collaboration with South African experts who know the languages in question very well is possible. More extensive elicitation, analysis of everyday speech as far as possible, and targeted construction storyboards. And targeted construction storyboards are going to be very crucial to the whole rest of the project. And in case people don't know about them, I will present them a little bit further here, because I think they're useful for many things and quite good to know about. So this is the webpage, totemfieldstoryboards.org, where you can look for by subject and download a lot of stories and use them. And they're all licensed by a Creative Commons license, so that you can use them and change them and make your own and upload them too. And this is copied from the web page, a description of their goals and ideas. So it's a language technique that tries to gather authentic speech with as little influence from English as possible, while also targeting particular constructions. So instead of just trying to have people talk naturally and hope that the constructions in question come up, or ask people to translate things which might be more unnatural. They try to get very precise constructions, but also in very natural contexts. So instead of asking, how do I say, they ask for a narration of a story, and then it's likely to be a lot more natural. And the storyboards themselves are designed to bring out meanings, distinctions that can be very subtle and might not be encoded in English, which of course is the standard language out of which all linguistics is based. And the end goal is to discover what meaning distinctions are possible across human languages. And I think the best way to see how they work is to show you one. And I'm sorry if these are old for you, but I thought if they're new for someone, they would be really good to say. This one is called this one's called On the Lamb. And it tests for different flavors of modal possibilities. And you can see which one, modal possibility, sorry. You can see which ones you spot. I've included English subtitles, but they wouldn't be included in the actual elicitation session. So we're specifically not going for translation. Instead, at least in one methodology, there are other possible ways of using them. First, the elicitor would present the story informally in English or another contact language, and then the speakers have a chance to collect their thoughts and tell the story in the language under investigation. And then later it can be transcribed and very importantly used for follow-up questions afterwards. So without further ado, here is On the Lamb. So we have John and Sue, kind of anime looking characters. They're out fishing one day. And suddenly police officers pull up in a boat and they say, oh no, let's get out of here. So they run and they find an old abandoned cottage and they say, oh, let's hide in here. We can hide inside this cottage. But where can we hide? John asked. And Sue has some suggestions. She said, we could hide in that box, or we could hide under the bed, or we could hide behind the curtain. And John's a logical thinker, so he says, well, we can't hide in the box. It's too small. We won't fit. And we can't hide under the bed. It's too short. So we have to hide behind the curtain. And so they hide behind the curtain. And then the police hot on the trail come and they find the cabin and they say, where could they be hiding? Well, they could be hiding in that box, or they could be under the bed, or they could be behind the curtain. And once again, the other police officer says, well, they can't be inside that box because it's too small. Good thinking. They can't be under the bed because it's too short. They must be behind that curtain. And so they check behind the curtain, but they're gone. They were able to escape through the window. And then they say, oh no, how are we going to return their lost wallet? So you can see these are cute little stories, easy to remember. Often they have a funny ending. So they can be a lot of fun to use in elicitation, and they also get a lot of good natural expressions. They're easy for people to remember. So in my experience, and this is what I've also read about them, even across several weeks, people tend to remember the stories, especially with the picture prompts. And that can be very useful when you go back and ask for something again, or talk about it, or talk about a particular expression that was used. They produce more natural data than straight translation does. And they're a straightforward way to build relatively parallel spoken corpora, which is going to be important in this project. So I'll show one more storyboard here to give a quick illustration of how a story brought up modal differences very quickly between two related South African languages. So this one is called Basketball Brothers. This is Tom. He loves to play basketball. And this is his older brother, Jim. Jim is really good at basketball. And Tom is not so good, but he wishes he could join the basketball team and play with his big brother, Jim. And so he goes and says, Mom, could I join the basketball team with Jim? And the mom says, Jim, could Tom join the basketball team with you? And Tom says, okay, Mom, first of all, he's got to be older, and he's not tall. He has to be tall, and he has to be able to run fast, and he has to be able to shoot the basketball well, but that's never going to happen. And the mom says, yes, it will. He will get older, and he will get tall, and he will be able to run fast, and he will shoot the basketball well. Once he gets older, he'll do all of these things. And he did. Just 1 year later, Tom joined the team. So I did this test with Ndebele and Ndebele with Peter Mavena, who unfortunately had to leave for another meeting, and Jerry Saimalebana, who were both visiting us at different times in Helsinki. Just quickly, an overview of Ndebele and Northern Ndebele and Southern Ndebele. So Ndebele is mostly spoken in Limpopo province. It's not officially recognized in South Africa, but there is a community of speaker activists, and it is still very much alive. And it is spoken in heavy contact with Sepedi or Sesotho Letsaleboa. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing anything wrong. Versus East Ndebele, which is mostly spoken in Gauteng and Mpumalanga. And it's an official language of South Africa, and it has educational support through the university level. And there are about at 1.1 million mother tongue speakers, and I think about an equal number of second language speakers. So you can see that sociolinguistically, they're quite in different statuses, and indeed Ndebele shows, I think, well, both have contact with Sepedi and influence from it. I think Ndebele has a lot greater level of influence. And here, excuse me, are just two excerpts from this story. And if you know some Nguni languages, you can see that they didn't say he has to run fast, but they said he can't run fast.
Ebile a kgone go phosa gore a kgone go kora.
I was pause ball.
Okay. Now, actually, it turns out that Basketball Brothers is not an ideal storyboard in the South African context, which some of you might have already thought of. This isn't a judgment of the storyboard itself, just its appropriateness to the context. So speakers found it pretty difficult to tell the characters apart. Basketball is not super widely played in South Africa. And as we saw, speaker retellings didn't match the originally intended structures very closely. However, the story was hugely useful, and it led to the discovery of this important contrast that we've been talking. And of course, I should say that just by looking at what speakers said, you can't say, well, this is a, you can say this is a frequency contrast, but you can't say that this is a grammatical or lexical contrast. But after extensive follow-up questioning, we determined that yes, these two languages do have this contrast, and with storyboards, follow-up is easy. So again, we can see that this know-how to, in terms of a non-learned ability, is used very frequently in East Ndebele and can't be used in Ndebele. So one project goal then is to develop and share more storyboards that target the relevant modal differences as they emerge in the project that are relevant to a broad South or Southern African context. For example, we might use football instead of basketball in such a case. And if possible, I would like to hire South African artists to do some of the illustrations. Okay, so that's phase 2. Use these tools to develop deep understandings of the modal systems of 2 or 3 languages. And then in phase 3, the goal is to create and analyze parallel corpora of L1 and L2 speech. So we'll recruit speakers of language A and language B, whatever they turn out to be. They will speak both of these languages, and one of them will be what we'll call L1 and L2. Of course, first and second language are not super meaningful terms in highly multilingual contexts. For example, you might have a situation where your mother speaks language A and your father speaks language B, or your family speaks language A, but the community speaks language B. And in such, it can be really hard then to say, well, what is your second language? But I'm using them here as placeholders for more complex conditions, and speaker proficiency will be assessed by what speakers themselves say. And then we'll also have ideally language experts to be able to listen to speakers and judge their overall, how close they come to sounding like what might be construed as a native speaker. It's hard to even talk about these things, but we're drawing these artificial boundaries in order to be able to get more nuance later on. The research question of phase 3 is mostly how do speakers perceive and adhere to differences, and how do they correlate to actual differences when there are differences in modal functions between the languages. So the experiment planned is to have speakers tell, a lot of speakers, as many as possible, tell storyboard stories in their L1 or their L2. And then 1 week later to come back and tell the same stories in the other language. And the order will be randomized to avoid priming effects. And then to transcribe and analyze and quantify modal uses, especially where cross-linguistic differences are expected. So in the former example, we might see, well, does the Ndebele speaker use Asi forms in learned ability in non-learned context if they're speaking Ndebele, although this isn't possible in Ndebele. And the analysis will try to answer the questions: to what degree do speakers miss the cross-linguistic distinctions predicted in the modal mappings that were done in previous phases? We'll also interview speakers about their language histories and identities, and try to see, well, how much do what they say about their language identities, how does that correlate with whether they tend to minimize or maximize distinctions between the languages, and also how do speakers assess self and outside assess proficiency levels correlate with the productions of distinctions. And to the extent that this works, we should end up with a large naturalistic and generally parallel corpus of quote unquote L1 and L2 speech, which can be used for many purposes besides just this project. Hopefully with the storyboards, a set of useful elicitation materials that will be broadly applicable for across Southern Africa, and a better understanding of how speakers handle subtle cross-linguistic differences in their linguistic repertoires. And now project plan phase 4. This is the most fuzzy part because so little is known so far from the first 3 phases. However, I know that lots of work has already been done on multilingual discourse in South Africa and around Africa. And my aim here is to take a quantitative approach, if it's at all possible, by focusing on a single linguistic feature, that is modal expressions and their cross-linguistic distinctions. So the research question here is, when segmentic and pragmatic mismatches occur, how are they accommodated by interlocutors? And the so-called experiment here is to have conversations by bilingual speakers with 2 different L1s across several variables. So in one condition, we'll say use language A or language B, and in another condition, we won't specify which language should be used. There will be situations in which the discourse topic is specified, and others will be just more free conversation to get maximally naturalistic versus maximal use, hopefully, of modal expressions. Some topics that we might specify, we might ask an L2 speaker to tell a storyboard story to L1 speaker who won't be able to see the pictures, him or herself. Or we might say, okay, let's talk about what children should not or cannot do or can do or should do, and so forth. And then the goal is to transcribe and analyze these, also video if possible, but to analyze these conversations and catalog all the modal uses, determine where mismatches between the 2 languages would have been possible, and then see what happens at these points. Do they just use a more general expression? Do they use repair strategies? Do they simplify their language? Do they, repair strategies would be like, do they correct themselves or somehow gently correct each other? Are there misunderstandings? Or do topics change? Do they imply code switching? Do they use another language entirely? Or as I said, did they use more general modal forms that work well in both languages in that context, even though they might not be the most appropriate to or most fitting to the context? This all feels very aspirational still, but the expected outcomes would be a nice corpus of multilingual discourse, and hopefully a better understanding of how speakers collaborate to deal with subtle cross-linguistic differences in their linguistic repertoires. So in conclusion, I hope this project will shed light on the important topic of modal systems in South African Bantu languages, which will be useful overall, I think, for language development, for pedagogy, for typology, and for linguistic theory. And then also how are differences performed and accommodated by multilingual speech speakers in natural multilingual situations. And as I've already said, I would love to have questions, feedback, suggestions, criticisms, or anything you want to throw at me. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, this was super interesting to me, and I'm sure also to the other people who are here. We're not a very large group, so please feel free to turn on your microphone to ask a question rather than raise your hand, I think. So if somebody wants to start.
And I can, yeah. Well, I'll keep the screen sharing in case it's useful, but I can also turn it off.
So does anyone have a first question? I was thinking from a Bloemfontein perspective, the modal that meant withstanding the call to do something was also going to be very useful.
Yeah.
Local variant, maybe it's something to look for. That's really interesting. But yeah, I thought the differences between, so I'm going to talk since it seems nobody else is ready yet. I thought the differences between Aussie and Sebo were really interesting. And I think you didn't have a Sesotho. So you said that in Northern Sotho, that's not possible, right? So that's
as far as, I mean, I can't say for sure, but according to Google, it's either not possible or it's extremely uncommon.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I don't have anything to say about it and from a sort of data perspective, but that is interesting. So Hannah and I have started looking at auxiliaries, but we haven't yet done this kind of targeted data collection. And in our first project field trip that I mentioned to you recently, we just collected natural data. So now I'm waiting for some of it to be transcribed and then we'll see what's in there. But hopefully some relevant constructions will also be there, although a lot of it is more past focused narrative. But we had a lot of people talk about life experiences and what they do, maybe more than talk about their occupations or something and what that involves. But some of that should also involve modals, and we did interview at least some people also talking about their future plans. But yeah, so anyone else with a question so
far? It's more, like a sort of a conceptual question for my own benefit as well, because it's something that I've been wondering about. Because we're looking at variation in Swahili and how it varies depending on language contact or even multiple dialects. Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned it a number of times about how they are sort of, imaginary reified distinctions between these languages. And, some of the literature says, compellingly or not, that it's not languages that shift and change and die, it's the people. So I wonder if you've thought about sort of attacking it from that level of looking at the individual rather than the languages, especially when your first research question, how do the languages maintain their sort of pragmatic and semantic difference, I think you said, in sort of multilingual contexts. So the extent to which that could be viewed at the level of the individual rather than the language.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I guess I have two things to say, and one is, yes, absolutely. I've been unable to do field work on this yet, so I haven't had. I don't unfortunately have that, although these surveys are going to a number of individuals, I don't have the data to be able to look at individuals. But yes, an important goal then is to see, well, is this really just an individual level thing, or can we say that at a language level this exists? On the flip side, I think in South Africa, in particular, I mean, language is a very political issue, and again, I'm not coming at this from a particularly expert position to be able to talk about it properly, but my understanding is that even though there's a lot of challenging history behind these named languages, in many cases they have been adopted as very strong identities, and many people feel very strongly that it's important that their language is distinct and that there is a standard, and that we can't say, okay, isiZulu and isiXhosa are just the same thing and they should be unified to one Nguni. Some people do say that, but so I think there's also a lot of motivation, at least on some parts, to have these languages be distinct entities. And so in the first stage of the project, the stance that I'm taking is that we're going to treat these languages as if they are distinct and have fault lines, at least in their standard varieties. I don't know, but yes, hopefully, especially when I get to South Africa, we can shed light on, well, where do these differences actually lie? Should we say that they're at a language level, or are they just at an individual level? But anybody from South Africa who has comments on that, I think could be able to speak to that a lot better than me.
So Tlumela is here, but she's been having some connection problems, I think. So I'm not sure. There are two of us as linguistics and language practice, and I see that she has sort of faded in and out. So maybe she has some comments if her connection is working well enough.
Hi, sorry, you'll hear a bit of background noise because I'm still in the waiting area somewhere. But yeah, I think the biggest thing in South Africa, yes, you do get a lot of strong ties between language and identity, and people tend to feel quite strongly in keeping their language quotation mark pure to some extent. But I guess when you look at the younger generation, you do see a lot of movement, and you do see less of that strict or tight hold on purity of language. So to some, yeah, I guess it will depend on what we see in the data, what she sees in the data, and so forth. But yeah, I think you will definitely see some kind of merge in some areas and not so much in others. Because you do also find a lot of differences when you're looking at the different South African language from a rural South African perspective, and also from a more urban, in more Joburg areas, bigger city perspective. So that tends to play a stronger role.
Right, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I imagine it would be really interesting to also look at which modals come through in the urban contact varieties, of which there seem to also be very different ones. At least my students all seem to be convinced that there are lots and lots of them, even in, say, Joburg or the greater area, based on all sorts of different languages. So that would be
well,
to look
I'm sorry. I'm so excited because actually I applied previous to applying for this. I applied for a different project that I didn't get, where I actually had a PhD student whose job was going to be to work in this very thing, like see what happens in urban varieties that are coming. And I might try to apply for this again, because I think it's a really important and interesting topic that could shed a lot of light on it. And if you know of any PhD students who might be interested in such a project, then I think it would be really cool.
That does sound great. I hope you are successful. I hope you apply again and that it works out next time. And yeah, if I find somebody who might be interested in this, I'll send them your way for sure.
I mean, without any promise of funding at this point, but yes, yeah.
I have a small.
Oh, Mr.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hi. I have a comment question. It's actually quite interesting, and actually, I'm sure Tlumela would be much more helpful here. I was collecting this data. Actually, I did it long ago, and then I didn't really analyze it that thoroughly. I just have notes, and I will look into them now because they were not part of my PhD, so I actually didn't focus on them that much. But actually, I got a lot of Noku instead of, for instance, I didn't get any Konas there. Like what you said, like the contrast between Kona and Quasi. I did get Quasi, obviously, but I got like Noku, like Unoku, I don't know what, Unoku Bala, something, like you can write something.
Okay.
And it's actually quite interesting because these meanings often overlapped as well. So this is obviously going to be a big challenge of the overlapping, like where does one end, where does one start, and their kind of replaceability in a way, mutual replaceability. Like what do you think about doing that? And is it have you actually seen any, have you noticed any major kind of differences between these closely related languages where you could say, okay, this marker is definitely not there, like like with like Kona, for instance, or something like that. Just wondering. I'm not saying Kona's not there, but in Xhosa, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like, for example, Kona is there in isiZulu, but it's marginal. whereas in Ndebele, it's quite often used. Another interesting thing from the survey so far, which I don't have, I mean, one statistical test said it was statistically significant, but I can't say that it applies at a language level, but like the frequency of the different, so for necessity modals, there are a couple in isiNdebele that don't seem to be used in isiZulu. And I think this has to do with isiNdebele having a lot more Sepedi influence and having like maybe a lot more multilingual speakers because it's not as big of a language and it's not had as long of an educational history. So I think it has in some ways like a wider inventory because it has had a lot more input from other languages. But yeah, so there's some that are in isiNdebele and not in, or are very marginal in isiZulu. But also the frequency of, I think I should really check, but the way I remember it is Kumele and Kufumele. No, sorry, I can't remember the markers right now. But it's also reversed. So like it was like 80-20 in isiNdebele, which one was used, and then in isiZulu it was 20-80 for those same markers. And so I think that's also, this frequency difference is also potentially quite interesting. And then it will be interesting then to see that I think that would be even a more difficult thing for a bilingual speaker to master, is this something like a frequency difference. So that's something that I'm really interested in the experiments. But does that answer your question?
Yeah,
sort of?
No, that's actually very interesting. And I really like the comment about corner actually, because corner is really, and frequency too. I mean, it's also a tricky thing, like how do you actually measure frequency with the elicitation? I mean,
Right.
But frequency is so important. You're completely right, because they can all appear everywhere, and then when you look at the frequency picture, they do something completely different.
Yeah. So I think these questionnaires, like the questionnaire that has 53 contexts total, something like that. And so there you already start to see which one are individuals using more, and then which ones trend overall in a language to be used more. But then especially once you start telling multiple stories, then frequency really comes out in a more naturalistic way that you might not get with direct translation. Although even then you can see, well, which markers does a person automatically use? Like, what is their default translation? And if that varies consistently from language to language, that's already quite compelling evidence, I think.
Great, thank you, and I think I'm really looking forward to the outcome and outcomes.
Me too. Thank you. Yeah, hopefully we can all travel freely sometime and start to really get into the details of the many interesting things that we all have hopes and plans for.
Yeah.
Yes, let's hope that happens. Yeah, I'm also finding this pattern really interesting. We're also finding this on an unrelated topic. Where we're testing some Zulu and also Ndebele data for Xhosa, and it's not working most of the time, and then it seems to work occasionally, and it's I have something to do with frequency. So I think also just as some of these topics are explored and understood, it will also help us work on other topics for the same group of languages, and sort of hopefully get a better picture overall. But yeah, so I think we can end the recording and sort of